The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned bright and clear over the central Pacific Ocean. Hundreds of miles of empty water stretched in every direction from a tiny speck of coral called Midway Atoll. On that speck, 3,000 American defenders waited nervously, knowing that the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled by Japan was steaming toward them at this very moment. 4 massive aircraft carriers, dozens of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, hundreds of the world's most experienced naval aviators, an invasion fleet carrying troops to occupy Midway and then, perhaps, Hawaii itself. The Japanese had been unstoppable for 6 months. Now they were coming to finish what they had started at Pearl Harbor. But the Japanese didn't know something crucial. They didn't know that their naval codes had been broken. They didn't know that American codebreakers working in the basement of a building at Pearl Harbor had deciphered their plans. And they didn't know that 3 American aircraft carriers were waiting in ambush northeast of Midway, their crews ready for the fight of their lives. What happened over the next 5 hours would change the course of World War II. It would break the back of Japanese naval power. And it would be decided not by battleships or admirals, but by a small group of dive bomber pilots flying an aircraft that would earn the nickname Slow but Deadly. This is the story of the Battle of Midway. To understand what happened at Midway, we need to go back 6 months, to December 7th, 1941. That Sunday morning, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing more than 2,000 Americans. It was a devastating blow, but it was also incomplete. The Japanese had missed the most important targets. 3 American aircraft carriers were at sea that day and escaped unharmed. The USS Enterprise, Yorktown, and Lexington would form the core of America's response in the Pacific. The months following Pearl Harbor were dark ones for the United States and its allies. Japanese forces seemed invincible. They conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. They pushed deep into Burma and threatened India. They occupied islands across the Pacific. Their carrier strike force, the Codebreakers, had never been defeated. It consisted of 6 large fleet carriers, each capable of launching dozens of aircraft. The pilots who flew from those carriers were the best in the world, veterans with years of training and months of combat experience. They had perfected the art of carrier aviation, and they knew it. But cracks were beginning to show in the Japanese offensive. In early May 1942, American and Japanese carrier forces clashed in the Coral Sea off the coast of New Guinea. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never saw each other. Everything was decided by aircraft. The Americans lost the carrier Lexington, and the Yorktown was badly damaged. But the Japanese lost the light carrier Shoho, and the fleet carrier Shokaku was so heavily damaged it would miss the next operation. Another carrier, Zuikaku, lost so many aircraft and pilots that it too would have to sit out the coming battle. The invasion of Port Moresby was turned back. For the first time, the Japanese offensive had been stopped. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was not pleased. He had conceived the Pearl Harbor attack and believed that aircraft carriers were now the decisive weapon in naval warfare. But he also believed that time was against Japan. America's industrial capacity was vastly superior. Already new carriers were under construction. If Japan was going to win the war, it had to be soon, before American production overwhelmed Japanese forces. Yamamoto devised a plan. He would attack Midway Atoll, a tiny American outpost halfway between Hawaii and Japan. The island itself was not particularly valuable, but Yamamoto believed its capture would force the American carriers to come out and fight, and when they did, the Codebreakers would destroy them. Without carriers, America could not project power across the Pacific. Japan would then be free to consolidate its conquests and build an impregnable defensive perimeter. The American people, faced with the prospect of years of bloody island-hopping campaigns, would sue for peace. At least, that was the plan. But Yamamoto's plan had a fatal flaw. Japanese naval codes had been compromised. In the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters at Pearl Harbor, a team of codebreakers led by Commander Joseph Rochefort worked around the clock to decipher Japanese communications. They were brilliant mathematicians, linguists, and pattern recognition experts. By May 1942, they could read enough of the Japanese JN-25 naval code to understand the broad outlines of enemy plans. They knew a major operation was coming. They knew the target was designated AF. But where was AF? Rochefort believed AF was Midway. To test his theory, he arranged for Midway to send an unencrypted radio message saying the island's water distillation plant had broken down. Sure enough, within days, Japanese messages mentioned that AF was short of fresh water. The codebreakers had their confirmation. They could now tell Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, exactly when and where the Japanese would strike. Nimitz quickly realized he had been given an extraordinary gift. If he could position his carriers correctly, he could ambush the Japanese force. It would be risky. The Japanese still had 4 carriers against his 3, but with surprise on his side and land-based aircraft from Midway, he had a chance. There was one problem. The Yorktown had been badly damaged in the Coral Sea. Experts estimated it would take 3 months to repair her in a proper shipyard. Nimitz didn't have 3 months. He had 3 days. He ordered Yorktown into dry dock at Pearl Harbor and told the repair crews to do whatever they could in 72 hours. 1,400 workers swarmed over the carrier, working 24 hours a day. They welded steel plates over bomb holes. They replaced damaged boilers. They jury-rigged systems that should have been completely rebuilt. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. On May 30th, just 3 days after entering dry dock, Yorktown put to sea. Her crew knew she wasn't fully operational, but they were going to fight anyway. The Enterprise and Hornet had already sailed, forming Task Force 16 under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance was not a carrier admiral. He was a cruiser officer filling in for Admiral William Halsey, who was hospitalized with a skin condition. Some officers worried that Spruance lacked experience with carrier operations. They were about to find out that Spruance was one of the most brilliant tactical minds in the U.S. Navy. Yorktown formed Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who was overall commander of the operation. Fletcher had fought at Coral Sea and knew what to expect. The 2 task forces rendezvoused at a position optimistically codenamed Point Luck, 350 miles northeast of Midway. There they waited, knowing the Japanese were coming, but not knowing exactly when they would arrive. Meanwhile, Midway itself was being reinforced. Admiral Nimitz sent every available aircraft to the tiny atoll: Marine Corps dive bombers and fighters, Army Air Force B-17 flying fortresses, Navy PBY Catalina patrol planes. By early June, Midway had about 115 aircraft of various types. Most of the pilots were inexperienced, and the aircraft were a hodgepodge of different models, some nearly obsolete, but they would provide reconnaissance and strike capability that the carriers alone could not match. The defenders dug trenches, set up anti-aircraft guns, and laid mines. They knew they were targets and prepared accordingly. The Japanese plan was complex, perhaps too complex. Admiral Yamamoto divided his forces into multiple groups. One carrier force would attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, a diversion meant to draw American attention north. The main carrier striking force, commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, would approach Midway from the northwest with 4 carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were 4 of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor. Behind them, hundreds of miles back, would come Admiral Yamamoto himself with the main body, including the massive battleship Yamato and supporting carriers. An invasion force with troop transports would approach from the southwest. It was an elaborate dance, and it required precise timing and coordination. What the Japanese didn't know was that the Americans weren't falling for the Aleutian diversion and were waiting at point luck. On June 3rd, a PBY Catalina flying a search pattern 600 miles west of Midway spotted the Japanese invasion force. The contact report sent a jolt through American commanders. The battle was beginning. B-17 seconds from Midway attacked the invasion force, but scored no hits. High-altitude level bombing against moving ships was nearly impossible, a fact that would be demonstrated repeatedly over the next few days. But the Japanese now knew they had been spotted. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force, pressed ahead. His orders were to attack Midway, suppress its defenses, and clear the way for the invasion. He would launch at dawn on June 4th. The morning of June 4th started early for everyone. At 4:30 a.m., Nagumo began launching his strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, bombers, and fighters roared off the 4 carrier decks and headed southeast. At the same time, scout planes from the Japanese cruisers and carriers launched to search the waters to the east and south. This was standard procedure, meant to ensure no American ships were nearby. But there was a problem. One of the scout planes, the one assigned to search the sector where the American carriers were actually located, had a catapult malfunction and launched 30 minutes late. That delay would prove catastrophic. On Midway, radar picked up the incoming Japanese strike at 75 miles out. Air raid sirens wailed. Every available aircraft on the island scrambled. Fighters climbed to intercept the attackers. Bombers and patrol planes fled to avoid being caught on the ground. The Marine fighter pilots, most flying obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters, bravely engaged the Japanese aircraft but were badly mauled. The Zeros escorting the Japanese bombers were simply superior aircraft flown by superior pilots. 2/3 of the Marine fighters were shot down. The Japanese bombers struck Midway hard. They hit buildings, fuel tanks, and parked aircraft. They cratered the runways. But they didn't knock out Midway's ability to launch aircraft, and they didn't destroy the critical installations. The strike leader radioed back to Admiral Nagumo that a second strike would be necessary. This message would trigger a series of decisions that would doom the Japanese carrier force. On board Nagumo's flagship, the carrier Akagi, the admiral faced a dilemma. His aircraft had just bombed Midway, but he had reserved half his strike force in case American ships appeared. Those aircraft were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, weapons meant for ships, not land targets. If he was going to launch a second strike on Midway, he would need to swap out those anti-ship weapons for general-purpose bombs suitable for attacking land targets. It would take time, maybe an hour. But Nagumo didn't think American carriers were nearby. None of his scout planes had reported any ships, so he gave the order. Begin rearming for a second strike on Midway. Then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. The scout plane that had launched late finally sent its report. One of the most famous messages in naval history. Ship sighted. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo was stunned. Enemy ships? What kind of ships? Carriers? The scout didn't say. Nagumo immediately ordered the rearming halted. Keep the anti-ship weapons. We may need them. Then came the agonizing wait for clarification. For 30 minutes, Nagumo and his staff waited, while the scout plane flew closer to identify the American ships. During that time, the aircraft that had struck Midway were returning, low on fuel, needing to land immediately. The flight decks had to be cleared. Then, at 8:09, came the message Nagumo dreaded. The enemy force includes what appears to be a carrier, an American carrier. Out here, Nagumo now faced an impossible situation. His strike aircraft were on the hangar decks, some armed with torpedoes, some with land bombs. The Midway strike force was circling overhead, desperate to land. His carrier's flight decks were cluttered with aircraft. He needed to get organized, to launch a proper strike against this American carrier. But he needed time. Time to land the Midway strike force. Time to rearm and refuel aircraft. Time to organize the attack. He made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. Recover the Midway strike force first, then prepare to launch against the American carriers. It was the doctrine he had been taught. Take care of your own aircraft first, then attack. But it was also a decision that would cost him the battle. Meanwhile, the 3 American carriers were already launching. Fletcher, aboard Yorktown, ordered Spruance to attack immediately with Enterprise and Hornet while Yorktown recovered her scout planes. Spruance didn't hesitate. At 7:02 a.m., Enterprise began launching every available aircraft. Then, Hornet followed suit. Over the next 2 hours, the 2 carriers launched 117 dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. They formed up and headed west toward the Japanese position reported by the scout planes. Yorktown held back initially, but would launch her own strike later in the morning. The American attack would be uncoordinated. Different types of aircraft flew at different speeds and different altitudes. The fighters struggled to keep up with the dive bombers. The torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable, pushed ahead on their own. There was no overall plan, no elegant tactical coordination. It was organized chaos, but sometimes chaos can work in your favor. The first Americans to find the Japanese carriers were the torpedo bomber squadrons. These brave men were flying obsolete TBD Devastators, slow and poorly armed. To drop their torpedoes, they had to fly low and straight, approaching to within 1,000 yards of their targets. They would be sitting ducks for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. And they were. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet attacked first, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. Waldron led 15 aircraft against the Japanese carriers. 0 fighters and anti-aircraft fire tore his squadron apart. One by one, the Devastators fell into the sea, trailing smoke and flame. Only one man from Torpedo 8 survived, Ensign George Gay, who was shot down and spent the rest of the battle floating in the ocean, watching the action unfold. Not a single torpedo hit. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. Same result. Zeros swarmed them. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. 10 of the 14 aircraft were shot down. No hits. Then came Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. They pressed their attack with the same courage and met the same fate. 5 of the 12 aircraft were lost. Again, no hits. By 10:20 a.m., 3 American torpedo squadrons had been effectively destroyed. 35 aircraft shot down, 55 aircrew killed or missing. The Japanese carriers remained untouched. It seemed like another American disaster was unfolding. Admiral Nagumo might have allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His carriers had beaten off a major attack. Yes, the Americans had carriers out there, but they had revealed themselves and accomplished nothing. Now it was time to hit back. But the torpedo attacks had accomplished something crucial, though nobody realized it at the time. They had drawn the Japanese fighter cover down to the surface. Dozens of Zeros were at low altitude, chasing and shooting down the slow torpedo bombers. They had burned through their ammunition. Some needed to land to refuel and rearm. And crucially, they were not in position to defend against an attack from above. At that exact moment, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers arrived over the Japanese carrier force. They had been searching for the Japanese for over an hour. Some squadrons had flown the wrong direction and never found the target. But 3 squadrons had continued searching, and now, almost by accident, they were in perfect position. They were at altitude. The Japanese fighters were down low. The Japanese carriers were in the middle of the most vulnerable operation in carrier warfare, recovering and launching aircraft. Flight decks were crowded with planes. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks. Ordnance was stacked and ready to be loaded. It was a perfect target. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, leading the dive bombers from Enterprise, was almost out of fuel. His squadron had flown the prescribed search pattern and found nothing. The Japanese should have been there, but weren't. McClusky made a decision that would change history. Instead of turning back, he would continue searching. He spotted a Japanese destroyer down below, steaming northeast. It was headed somewhere. McClusky bet it was headed back to the carriers. He followed its wake. At 10:22 a.m., he saw them. 4 Japanese carriers in a rough box formation, turning into the wind to launch aircraft. McClusky didn't wait. He pushed over his radio button and gave the attack order. 33 dive bombers from Enterprise rolled over and dove toward the carriers Kaga and Akagi. At almost the same moment, 17 dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, arrived over the Japanese force from a different direction. They had been launched later and taken a more direct route. Now they were in position over a different target, the carrier Soryu. Leslie's attack was even more perfectly timed than McClusky's. The Yorktown dive bombers rolled over and plunged towards Soryu, just as the Enterprise dive bombers were beginning their attacks. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. One moment, they were preparing to launch a devastating counterattack. The next moment, American dive bombers were screaming down on them from all directions. 3 carriers were under attack simultaneously. The dive bombing attack was one of the most precisely choreographed maneuvers in military aviation. The pilot would position his aircraft above and behind the target, usually at about 15,000 to 20,000 feet. Then he would roll inverted and pull through, pointing the nose straight down at the target. The SPD Dauntless dive bomber was specifically designed for this maneuver. It had perforated dive flaps that deployed automatically, creating enormous drag and limiting the aircraft's speed during the dive. Without those flaps, the plane would accelerate past 400 miles per hour and become uncontrollable. With the flaps, the speed stabilized around 240 knots, fast enough to make the plane difficult to hit but slow enough for the pilot to aim accurately. As the pilot dove, he would lean forward in his straps, peering through a simple telescopic sight mounted in the windscreen. The target, a carrier deck, was rushing up at him. He had to compensate for wind, for the target's movement, for the trajectory of his bomb. He had to ignore the anti-aircraft fire bursting around him, the tracers reaching up from the ships below, the possibility that a Zero might drop onto his tail at any second. He had to focus entirely on that sight picture, keeping the crosshairs on target. At around 2,500 feet, usually after about 30 seconds of diving, he would pull the bomb release. The 1,000-pound bomb would drop away, stabilized by fins. The pilot would immediately haul back on the stick, pulling 5 or 6 Gs, feeling the blood drain from his head as the plane wrenched out of the dive and climbed away. Behind him, his rear seat gunner would be watching for fighters and reporting the bomb's impact. The entire attack, from the moment the first bomber rolled in until the last bomb hit, took about 6 minutes. 6 minutes that changed the war. On the Kaga, Lieutenant Dick Best from Enterprise scored a direct hit near the island's superstructure. His 1,000-pound bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, setting off a chain reaction among the fueled and armed aircraft stacked below. Fires erupted immediately. More bombs hit Kaga's flight deck, tearing huge holes and triggering secondary explosions. Within minutes, the carrier was a blazing inferno. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, took a bomb hit near the midship elevator. It too penetrated to the hangar deck, where it exploded among aircraft that were being rearmed and refueled. The explosion ignited aviation gasoline and detonated torpedo warheads. Fires spread out of control. Another bomb hit near the port side aft elevator, wrecking the flight deck. Akagi was doomed. Soryu took 3 bombs from the Yorktown dive bombers in rapid succession. 1 hit forward of the island, 1 amidships, and 1 aft. All 3 penetrated to the hangar deck. Like her sister carriers, Soryu's hangar was packed with aircraft, fuel, and ordnance. The bombs set off massive explosions and fires. The carrier's crew fought desperately to save their ship, but the damage was too severe. All 3 carriers were burning furiously. Pilots who had been waiting in their cockpits to launch were killed instantly. Flight deck crews were engulfed in flames. Below decks, sailors struggled in smoke-filled compartments to contain the fires, but it was hopeless. The carrier's own weapons were destroying them. Torpedoes cooked off in the heat and exploded. Fuel tanks ruptured. Magazines detonated. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been positioned farther north than the other 3 and was not spotted by the initial American dive bombers. She escaped the devastating attack. But 3 of the 4 carriers of the Codebreakers had been mortally wounded in 6 minutes. It was the most decisive 6 minutes in naval history. On board the burning carriers, the scenes were hellish. Men burned alive in their aircraft or were blown overboard by explosions. The steel decks became too hot to stand on. Officers and crew tried to fight the fires, but water pressure failed as the ships lost power. Some men jumped overboard to escape the flames, only to be sucked into the propellers or left behind as the carrier's escorts moved away. The destroyers and cruisers screening the carriers could do little but watch in horror as the great ships burned. Admiral Nagumo, on the Akagi, was urged by his staff to transfer his flag to another ship. The carrier was clearly doomed. Reluctantly, Nagumo and his staff climbed down ropes to a boat that took them to a nearby destroyer. It was a humiliating moment for an admiral who had commanded the most powerful naval strike force in the world just an hour earlier. But the battle wasn't over. Hiryu was still operational, and her captain was determined to strike back. At 10:50 a.m., Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters against the American carriers. The Japanese pilots were veteran aviators, among the best in the world. They had been at Pearl Harbor, had fought in the Dutch East Indies and the Indian Ocean. They knew their business. Using smoke from the burning carriers as a reference point, they flew northeast toward where the American carriers had to be. Just after noon, they found Yorktown. The carrier was operating alone, having sent her escorts with Enterprise and Hornet. Her combat air patrol of fighters intercepted the incoming Japanese aircraft, but some got through. The Japanese dive bombers attacked from multiple directions, a well-coordinated strike. Yorktown twisted and turned, her captain skillfully conning the ship to avoid the falling bombs. But 3 bombs hit. One struck near the midship elevator, penetrating several decks before exploding and starting fires. Another hit near the smokestack, putting several boilers out of commission and reducing the ship's speed. A third hit on the flight deck, blowing a large hole. Yorktown shuddered under the impacts, but kept moving. Damage control parties went to work immediately. They fought the fires, shored up damaged bulkheads, and got the boilers back online. Within 2 hours, Yorktown was making 20 knots and could launch and recover aircraft. It was a remarkable achievement of damage control and crew training. The carrier had taken 3 bomb hits and survived, a testament to the skill of her crew and the robust design of American carriers. Admiral Fletcher transferred his flag to a cruiser, allowing Yorktown's captain to focus on saving his ship. But Hiryu wasn't done. At 1 p.m., the Japanese carrier launched a second strike. This time it was torpedo bombers, 10 Nakajima B-5Ns, escorted by 6 Zeros. Again, they found Yorktown. Again, the American fighters tried to stop them, but some broke through. The torpedo bombers came in low and fast, skimming just above the waves. They released their torpedoes at close range, too close for Yorktown to evade. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side within seconds of each other. The explosions tore massive holes in the hull. Water flooded into the ship. The carrier lost all power and began to list. It was too much. Yorktown's captain ordered abandoned ship. Destroyers moved alongside to take off the crew. Slowly, reluctantly, the men climbed down ropes and nets, leaving their ship to float dead in the water. But even as Yorktown was dying, American dive bombers were hunting Hiryu. At 2:45 p.m., scout planes from Enterprise located the last Japanese carrier. She was steaming northwest, trying to escape. Admiral Spruance didn't hesitate. He ordered an immediate strike. At 5 p.m., 24 dive bombers from Enterprise attacked Hiryu. Again, the SPD Dauntless proved its worth. 4 bombs hit the carrier in quick succession. The bombs started fires that quickly spread out of control. Hiryu's crew fought the fires through the night, but by morning, it was clear the carrier could not be saved. Her captain gave the order to abandon ship. Japanese destroyers torpedoed Hiryu to prevent her capture. She sank on the morning of June 5th. The Kido Butai was dead. All 4 carriers had been destroyed. 300 Japanese aircraft and their pilots were gone. The cream of Japanese naval aviation had been wiped out in a single day. The Americans had lost 1 carrier, Yorktown, and a destroyer. 150 aircraft had been lost, and 307 men were dead or missing. It was not a cheap victory. But the strategic impact was overwhelming. Japan had entered the battle with the most powerful carrier force in the world and had lost it in a day. They would build new carriers, train new pilots, but they would never again have the qualitative edge they enjoyed before Midway. The initiative in the Pacific had shifted to the Americans. The Japanese High Command debated whether to even tell the public about the disaster. They decided on a cover story. The carriers had been damaged, but were returning to Japan for repairs. The truth was too painful to admit. Yorktown was not quite done fighting. After the crew abandoned ship, the carrier remained afloat. A salvage team returned and began working to save her. Destroyers took her under tow, and it seemed she might make it back to Pearl Harbor. But on June 7th, a Japanese submarine, I-168, found the crippled carrier. Commander Yahachi Tanabe maneuvered his submarine through a screen of destroyers and fired 4 torpedoes. 2 hit Yorktown, and 2 hit the destroyer Hammond, which was alongside providing power to the carrier. Hammond broke in half and sank in minutes. Yorktown absorbed the new torpedo hits and still didn't sink. She floated through the night, listing heavily, but somehow staying afloat. It was as if the ship refused to die, but on the morning of June 7th, her list increased dramatically. At 7:01 a.m., Yorktown rolled over onto her port side, paused for a moment as if taking one last look at the world, and then slid beneath the waves. She had fought at Coral Sea, been bombed and torpedoed at Midway, and taken 2 more torpedoes from a submarine. She had fought to the last. Her crew would later say that she went down like the great lady she was, with her battle flag still flying. The Battle of Midway was a turning point in the Pacific War, but it was not the end. The fighting would continue for 3 more years. The island-hopping campaigns through the Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the brutal battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the fire bombings of Japanese cities, the atomic bombs that finally ended the war. But after Midway, the outcome was never really in doubt. Japan had lost its offensive capability. Its navy had been crippled. Its best pilots were dead. America's industrial might was just beginning to gear up. New carriers were being built. New aircraft were rolling off assembly lines. New pilots were being trained by the thousands. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy would have more carriers in the Pacific than Japan had possessed at the start of the war. The SBD Dauntless went on to serve throughout the Pacific Campaign. The rugged dive bomber would sink more enemy ships than any other Allied aircraft. 6 Japanese carriers, 14 cruisers, 6 destroyers, 15 transports, and scores of smaller vessels fell victim to the Dauntless. The aircraft earned the respect and affection of its pilots, who appreciated its reliability, its ability to take damage and keep flying, and its steady handling characteristics that made it an excellent platform for dive bombing. Yes, it was slow. Yes, it was obsolete by the end of the war. But on June 4th, 1942, it was exactly the right aircraft, in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. The pilots who flew the SBD at Midway became legends. Wade McClusky, who made the navigational decision that found the Japanese carriers. Maxwell Leslie, who led the Yorktown dive bombers against Soryu. Dick Best, who scored direct hits on both Akagi and later Hiryu, the only pilot to land bombs on 2 Japanese carriers in one day. Norman Dusty Kleiss, who put his bomb into Kaga and later hit the cruiser Mikuma. These men were not superhuman. They were young Americans, most in their 20s, who had been trained to do a job and did it under the most extreme pressure imaginable. Many of their friends died that day. 55 torpedo bomber crew members were killed in the attacks that preceded the dive bomber strikes. Marine pilots on Midway were shot down defending the island. Sailors died on Yorktown and Haman. The victory at Midway came at a cost. For the Japanese, Midway was a catastrophe from which they never recovered. The loss of 4 carriers was bad enough, but the loss of trained pilots and aircrew was even worse. The Japanese pilot training system had been designed for peacetime, emphasizing quality over quantity. It took years to produce a carrier pilot to Japanese standards. There was no mechanism to rapidly expand the training program. So, as experienced pilots were lost in combat, they were replaced by men with minimal training. By 1944, Japanese carrier pilots were going into combat with as little as 2 months of flight training. They stood no chance against American pilots who had 6 months to a year of intensive instruction. The Americans had created a pipeline that could produce thousands of well-trained pilots. The Japanese could not match it. The Japanese also learned painful lessons about carrier design and damage control. American carriers proved to be far more survivable than their Japanese counterparts. Yorktown took 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes, and still took almost 3 days to sink. The Japanese carriers at Midway were destroyed by their own ordnance as much as by American bombs. The practice of keeping fueled and armed aircraft on the hangar deck, ready for immediate launch, proved disastrous. When bombs penetrated to the hangar, they set off chain reactions that gutted the ships. American carriers had better fire suppression systems, better compartmentalization, and more robust construction. They could take more punishment and survive. This disparity would become even more apparent as the war progressed. Admiral Nimitz understood immediately what his forces had accomplished. In his report on the battle, he praised the courage and skill of the American pilots and crew. He also noted the crucial role of intelligence. Without the Codebreakers' work, the ambush would not have been possible. He recommended that the intelligence effort be expanded and protected. Japanese codes continued to be read throughout the war, giving American commanders insights into enemy plans and movements. This intelligence advantage was carefully guarded. Even after the war, the full extent of the code-breaking effort was kept secret for years to protect the sources and methods that had been used. Admiral Yamamoto was devastated by the defeat. He had gambled on a quick, decisive victory and lost. He withdrew the remaining Japanese forces and returned to base. He considered resigning but decided to stay on, hoping to rebuild the carrier force and find another opportunity to strike at the Americans. That opportunity would never come. Yamamoto would be killed in April 1943 when American fighters, guided by intelligence that had decrypted his travel plans, ambushed his aircraft over Bougainville. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor and the most capable naval strategist Japan had. His death was another blow to Japanese fortunes. The Battle of Midway has been studied and analyzed by military historians for 8 decades. What were the key factors that led to the American victory? Intelligence was crucial. Knowing where and when the Japanese would strike allowed Nimitz to position his forces for an ambush. Luck played a role. The timing of the American dive bomber attacks, arriving just as the Japanese fighters were at low altitude chasing torpedo bombers, was fortuitous. The delayed catapult launch of the Japanese scout plane that allowed the American carriers to remain undetected for an extra 30 minutes was another lucky break. But luck favors the prepared, and the Americans were prepared. American pilots were well-trained and aggressive. They pressed their attacks even in the face of overwhelming opposition. The Torpedo Squadron sacrificed themselves to draw down the Japanese defenses. The dive bomber pilots made the most of their opportunity, striking with precision and devastating effect. American damage control was superior, allowing Yorktown to survive damage that would have sunk a Japanese carrier. American tactical decisions, particularly Spruance's aggressive commitment of his forces and McClusky's decision to continue searching beyond the planned point, were sound and courageous. Japanese tactical decisions were flawed. Nagumo's hesitation when he received word of American carriers, his decision to recover his Midway strike force before attacking the American carriers, and the general complexity of the Japanese plan all contributed to the defeat. The Japanese had become overconfident after months of easy victories. They underestimated their opponents and paid the price. The legacy of Midway extends beyond World War II. It demonstrated the decisive power of aircraft carriers in naval warfare. Battleships, which had been the capital ships of navies for centuries, were now secondary. The carrier was king. This lesson was learned by every navy in the world and shaped naval doctrine for decades. It showed the importance of intelligence in modern warfare. The ability to read enemy communications and anticipate enemy moves could be decisive. It validated the concept of damage control as a critical skill. Ships that could survive damage and continue fighting had an enormous advantage, and it showed that courage and training could overcome material disadvantages. The Americans at Midway were outnumbered in carriers, outnumbered in aircraft, and facing pilots with more combat experience. But they won anyway, through determination, skill, and a little bit of luck. For the men who fought at Midway, the battle remained the defining moment of their lives. In the decades after the war, they would gather at reunions, share stories, honor fallen friends. They would speak at schools and museums, ensuring that new generations understood what had happened in those waters, northwest of a tiny atoll, in June 1942. They would return to Midway, standing on the airfield where their friends had died, looking out at the ocean where carriers had burned and men had fought for their lives. They would remember the roar of engines, the chatter of machine guns, the sight of bombs falling toward carrier decks, the satisfaction of seeing a direct hit, and the terror of watching friends disappear in flames. George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, spent hours floating in the water during the battle, watching from his life raft as the drama unfolded. He saw the Japanese carriers burn. He saw American dive bombers screaming down from the sky. He saw ships explode and sink. When he was finally rescued the next day, he had a story that few others could tell. He had witnessed the entire battle from the water, alone, vulnerable, but alive. His account became one of the most compelling first-hand narratives of the battle. He would spend the rest of his life telling the story of his squadron, the men who flew into certain death knowing they probably wouldn't come back, but attacking anyway, because that was their mission. Wade McClusky's decision to continue searching when his fuel was running critically low demonstrated the kind of initiative that wins battles. He could have turned back. His orders had been to search a specific area, and he had done that. The Japanese weren't where they were supposed to be. A more cautious commander would have returned to the carrier, preserved his aircraft and pilots for another day. But McClusky had a hunch. He saw that lone destroyer and reasoned it must be heading somewhere important. He followed it, and his gamble paid off. When he finally spotted the Japanese carriers and gave the order to attack, he had perhaps 5 minutes of fuel remaining. If he had turned back 10 minutes earlier, the dive bombers might never have found the Japanese carriers. The battle might have ended very differently. One man's decision changed history. Dick Best's achievement of hitting 2 carriers in one day was unprecedented. After his first attack on Akagi, he returned to Enterprise, rearmed and refueled, and went back out on the afternoon mission that found Hiryu. His bomb scored a direct hit near the carrier's forward elevator, starting the fires that would doom the ship. Best developed tuberculosis shortly after Midway, probably from inhaling caustic soda fumes from a faulty oxygen system during the battle. The disease ended his combat career, but he had already accomplished more than most pilots could dream of. He would live until 2001, dying at age 91, long enough to see his accomplishments recognized and honored. Norman Kleiss kept a detailed diary throughout the war, documenting his experiences day by day. His account of the Battle of Midway is one of the most detailed and accurate first-hand sources we have. He described the tension of searching for the Japanese carriers, the moment of spotting them, the dive through anti-aircraft fire, the satisfaction of seeing his bomb hit. He also described the emptiness of returning to the carrier and learning which of his friends hadn't made it back. Kleiss flew in 58 combat missions during the war, making him one of the most experienced dive bomber pilots in the Navy. He survived the war and lived until 2016, dying at age 100. In his final years, he worked with historians to ensure the story of the battle was accurately preserved. The Japanese pilots and sailors who survived Midway returned home to a nation that didn't know what had happened. The Japanese government and military kept the defeat secret. Survivors were isolated, forbidden from speaking about what they had witnessed. Some were sent to remote outposts where they couldn't spread rumors. The official story was that the carriers had been damaged but would return to service after repairs. It was months before the Japanese public learned the truth, and even then, the full scale of the disaster was downplayed. This culture of secrecy hampered Japan's ability to learn from the defeat and make necessary changes. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, was on board Akagi during the Battle of Midway. He was recovering from an appendectomy and watched the battle from the carrier's bridge. He witnessed the American dive bombers attacking, saw the bombs hit, felt the explosions that doomed his ship. He escaped with his life but was haunted by what he had seen. After the war, he wrote extensively about Midway, providing the Japanese perspective on the battle. His accounts, while sometimes contested by historians, offer valuable insights into Japanese planning and decision-making. Fuchida became a Christian missionary after the war, a dramatic transformation for a man who had been a warrior for most of his life. The wreckage of the Japanese carriers lay on the ocean floor for decades, unseen and forgotten. In 1998, a deep-sea exploration led by Dr. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered the Titanic, found the wreck of Yorktown. The carrier was sitting upright on the bottom, more than 3 miles down, remarkably well preserved in the cold, dark water. Her anti-aircraft guns were still manned by skeletons of sailors who had gone down with the ship. Her aircraft elevator was still in place. It was a haunting reminder of the battle and the men who fought it. In subsequent years, other expeditions found the wrecks of Akagi and Kaga, also sitting upright on the ocean floor. Their flight decks collapsed, but their hulls intact. These underwater archaeological sites are now protected as war graves, final resting places for the men who died there. The strategic implications of Midway rippled outward for the rest of the war. With the Japanese carrier force crippled, the Americans could go on the offensive. In August 1942, just 2 months after Midway, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. It was the first major American offensive operation of the war. The campaign would last 6 months and cost both sides dearly, but the Americans held the island. From Guadalcanal, they would work their way up the Solomons chain, then to New Guinea, then to the Philippines. Each step brought them closer to Japan. The Japanese attempted to rebuild their carrier force, but they never regained the capability they had possessed before Midway. New carriers were built, including the massive Taiho and Shinano, but there weren't enough trained pilots to fill them. The air groups that did form were inadequate compared to the pre-war standard. When the new Japanese carriers finally saw action in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, they were decimated. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In one day, the Japanese lost 3 carriers and over 400 aircraft. It was Midway in reverse, except even more one-sided. The Japanese carriers that survived the Philippine Sea barely participated in the rest of the war. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japanese carriers were used as decoys, empty shells with skeleton air groups, meant to draw American attention, while Japanese battleships attacked the invasion fleet. The strategy failed. The carriers were sunk, and the battleships were turned back. By 1945, Japan's navy was finished. The few surviving carriers sat in port, unable to sortie due to lack of fuel and pilots. The battleship Yamamoto, the largest battleship ever built, was sent on a suicide mission to Okinawa in April 1945 with only enough fuel for a one-way trip. She was sunk by American carrier aircraft long before she reached her destination. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had been the 3rd largest navy in the world in 1941 and had controlled the Pacific from Hawaii to India, was reduced to a handful of ships hiding in harbors, waiting for the end. The American carrier force, meanwhile, had grown to overwhelming size. By mid-1945, the U.S. Navy had nearly 100 aircraft carriers of various types operating in the Pacific. The Essex-class fleet carriers, the backbone of the force, were superb ships, faster and tougher than their pre-war predecessors. The Independence-class light carriers, built on cruiser hulls, provided additional air power. And the escort carriers, small and slow but numerous, provided air support for amphibious operations and anti-submarine patrols. American carrier task forces roamed the Pacific at will, striking targets throughout Japan and its remaining possessions. Japanese ships rarely left port. When they did, they were quickly found and sunk. The industrial disparity between the United States and Japan was staggering. In 1941, American shipyards built 1 aircraft carrier. In 1944, they built 22. In 1941, American factories produced 19,000 aircraft. In 1944, they produced 96,000. Japan could not compete. Its shipyards, factories, and refineries were being systematically destroyed by American bombing. Its merchant fleet, which brought vital resources from conquered territories, was being gutted by American submarines. By 1945, Japan was being strangled. Food was scarce. Fuel was almost non-existent. Industrial production had collapsed. The war was lost, but the Japanese military leadership refused to admit it. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 finally forced Japan to surrender. But even without the atomic bombs, Japan could not have continued fighting. The naval blockade and conventional bombing had already rendered the country unable to wage war. The atomic bombs simply provided the excuse the Japanese government needed to surrender without losing too much face. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast. For most Japanese citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard their emperor's voice. The war was over. For the veterans of Midway, the end of the war brought mixed emotions. Relief that the fighting was finally over, joy at the prospect of going home, sadness for the friends who hadn't survived to see this day. Many struggled to adjust to civilian life. The intensity and purpose of wartime service was hard to replicate in the mundane world of peacetime jobs and family responsibilities. Some thrived, building successful careers and families. Others struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, though at the time it was just called shell shock or battle fatigue and was poorly understood. The aircraft that had fought at Midway were quickly retired. The SBD Dauntless was obsolete by war's end, replaced by more modern dive bombers like the Curtiss Helldiver. The TBD Devastator had been withdrawn from frontline service after Midway, replaced by the TBF Avenger. The fighters that had escorted them, F-4F Wildcats, gave way to F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs. The old aircraft were scrapped or sold as surplus. A few ended up in museums, preserved as examples of the aircraft that had won the war. Most were simply cut up for scrap metal, their war-winning service forgotten in the rush to modernize. But the memory of Midway endured. Books were written, movies were made, documentaries were produced. The battle became a centerpiece of American naval history, studied at the Naval Academy and war colleges around the world. What went right? What went wrong? What lessons could be learned? Military historians dissected every decision, every action, every outcome. Some of the veterans participated in this analysis, providing their perspectives. Others preferred not to relive those days, finding the memories too painful. In Japan, Midway was also studied, though with a different perspective. What had gone wrong? How had the mighty Kido Butai been destroyed so quickly? Japanese analysts identified numerous mistakes. The plan had been too complex. Intelligence had been inadequate. The scout plane launch delay had been catastrophic. The decision to rearm for a second strike on Midway had been wrong. Damage control procedures had been insufficient. But underlying all of these tactical and operational mistakes was a strategic error. Japan had started a war it could not win. The attack on Pearl Harbor had unified the American people and unleashed their industrial power. Once aroused, America was simply too big, too rich, too productive to be defeated. Japan's only hope had been a quick negotiated peace, and that hope had died at Midway. The 4 Japanese carriers lost at Midway were never replaced. Not really. Japan built new carriers, but they could never recreate the trained, experienced air groups that had gone down with Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Those pilots had been the product of a decade of intensive training. They had combat experience in China and throughout the Pacific. They were the elite, and they were irreplaceable. The new pilots who joined Japanese carriers after Midway were brave and determined, but they lacked the skill and experience of their predecessors. American pilots noticed the difference immediately. By late 1942, Veteran American aviators were reporting that Japanese pilots were noticeably less skilled than those encountered earlier in the war. By 1944, the gap had become a chasm. The United States Navy learned its own lessons from Midway. The importance of intelligence was reinforced, leading to expanded cryptanalysis efforts. The vulnerability of torpedo bombers became apparent, leading to changes in doctrine and eventually the replacement of the TBD with the more capable TBF Avenger. The effectiveness of dive bombing was proven, leading to continued emphasis on this tactic. The value of aggressive, well-trained pilots was demonstrated, leading to expanded training programs. And the critical importance of damage control was highlighted, leading to improved procedures and better equipment on new carriers. The Battle of Midway also provided a strategic lesson that would shape American planning for the rest of the war. Carriers were the key to victory in the Pacific. Control of the air meant control of the sea. Ships without air cover were vulnerable. Islands without air support could be isolated and captured. The war would be won by carriers and the aircraft they launched. This understanding drove American shipbuilding priorities. Carriers were built first, before battleships, before cruisers, before anything else. By 1944, American carrier task forces were the most powerful naval formations the world had ever seen, capable of projecting overwhelming air power across thousands of miles of ocean. The personal stories of the men who fought at Midway are what make the battle memorable beyond the statistics and strategic analysis. These were ordinary Americans, farm boys and city kids who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances. They rose to the challenge. They flew obsolete aircraft into the teeth of enemy defenses. They fought fires on burning ships. They stayed at their posts even when it seemed hopeless. They made split-second decisions that had strategic consequences. And they won. Ensign George Gay, floating in his life raft after being shot down, watched the Japanese carriers burn. He saw Akagi, wreathed in flames and smoke, listing heavily. He saw Kaga, explosions erupting from her hull. He saw Soryu, burning from bow to stern. And he knew, even before he was rescued, that something important had happened. The tide had turned. America was going to win this war. It would take 3 more years, countless more battles, and hundreds of thousands more casualties. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Midway had decided it. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who led Torpedo Squadron 8 to its doom, had written a letter to his wife before the battle. In it, he said that he believed his squadron would encounter Japanese carriers and that the attack would be dangerous. He said he would do his duty and hoped to return home, but if he didn't, she should know that he had done his best. Waldron and 14 of his 15 pilots were killed in the attack. They accomplished nothing in terms of direct damage to the enemy, but they drew the Japanese fighters down to the deck, setting up the dive bomber attacks that won the battle. Their sacrifice was not in vain. Every man in Torpedo 8 posthumously received the Navy Cross. Waldron posthumously received the Navy Cross and later a promotion to commander. His letter became one of the most poignant documents of the war, a reminder that the men who fought knew the risks and accepted them. The dive bomber pilots who delivered the fatal blows against the Japanese carriers were lionized, rightfully so. But they were quick to credit the torpedo bombers whose sacrifices made their attacks possible. Without Torpedo 8, Torpedo 6, and Torpedo 3, drawing away the Zeros and forcing the Japanese carriers to maneuver defensively, the dive bombers might have faced coordinated fighter opposition at altitude. The attacks might have been disrupted or driven off. The careful timing that allowed 3 carriers to be hit simultaneously might not have happened. The torpedo squadrons paid a terrible price, but their attacks were essential to the American victory. The Battle of Midway was not a perfect American victory. Mistakes were made. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise missed the Japanese carriers entirely on their first attack and had to be redirected. The fighters from Hornet never found the battle at all, returning to their carrier without seeing action. Coordination between different types of aircraft was poor, with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers arriving at different times rather than in a coordinated strike. Communications were problematic, with radio frequencies becoming cluttered and messages getting lost. Some bombs failed to explode due to faulty fuses. Some aircraft ran out of fuel and ditched before reaching their carriers. The victory was messy, improvised, and in many ways fortunate. But war is messy. Plans rarely survive contact with the enemy. The Americans at Midway adapted to circumstances, made the best decisions they could with the information available, and pressed their attacks with determination. That was enough. The Japanese, for all their experience and skill, made crucial mistakes at critical moments. They were unlucky with the timing of their scout plane launch. They were unlucky that the American dive bombers arrived at the exact moment when their fighters were at low altitude. They were unlucky that their carriers were in the middle of rearming operations when the attack came. But luck is part of war. The side that makes fewer mistakes and capitalizes on opportunities is the side that wins. In the decades since the battle, Midway has taken on an almost mythical quality in American naval history. It stands alongside Trafalgar, Tsushima, and Jutland as one of the decisive naval engagements that changed the course of history. The fact that it was an American victory, achieved against a larger and more experienced opponent, makes it particularly significant in the American narrative of World War II. The battle demonstrated American resilience, ingenuity, and courage. It showed that the disasters of Pearl Harbor and the Philippines could be overcome. It proved that American forces, properly led and equipped, could defeat the Japanese. For historians, Midway offers endless material for analysis. The role of intelligence in modern warfare, the importance of training and doctrine, the impact of technological factors like aircraft performance and carrier design, the significance of individual decisions in determining outcomes, the interaction of skill, luck, and courage in combat. These themes have been explored in countless books, articles, and dissertations. New perspectives continue to emerge as historians gain access to previously classified documents and as technology allows for more detailed analysis of the battle. The physical site of the battle remains largely undisturbed. The waters northwest of Midway Atoll are deep and remote, far from shipping lanes and populated areas. The wrecks of the carriers lie on the ocean floor, silent monuments to the men who died there. Midway Atoll itself is now a wildlife refuge, home to millions of seabirds and one of the world's largest albatross colonies. The concrete bunkers and runways from World War II are still visible, slowly being reclaimed by nature. A small memorial honors those who fought and died there. Visitors are rare, but those who make the journey find it a moving experience, standing on the spot where history turned. The veterans of Midway are nearly all gone now. The youngest would be in their late 90s if still alive. Their generation, often called the greatest generation, is passing into history, but their legacy endures. They faced the greatest challenge of their lives and met it with courage and determination. They fought not for glory or conquest, but because their country needed them. They served alongside men from every background, every region, every walk of life, united by a common purpose. They won a victory that helped preserve freedom and democracy. And they did it at Midway, in 5 minutes that changed the world. The Battle of Midway stands as a testament to the importance of preparation, intelligence, and courage in warfare. It demonstrates that numerical superiority and experience can be overcome by determination and tactical skill. It shows that individual decisions can have strategic consequences. And it reminds us that freedom is not free, that it must be defended by ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things. The men who fought at Midway understood this. They did their duty, many paying the ultimate price, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. Their story deserves to be remembered, studied, and honored. 5 minutes that changed the world. 5 minutes that showed the best of what America could be. 5 minutes at Midway.